And so the thinness of the bone adds some. The lack of sinuses adds some. The lack of depth of eye sockets adds some. But this takes away. This adds, but it doesn't balance up. It doesn't add up to fully 1/3 more. It's a real mystery. But the biggest mystery of all was your cerebellum sits here. It sits back here, protected by this curve of bone, and it's got these edges in the inside of the skull called sulcuses. You can feel them in this. You've got to be real careful if you do this, but if you have a need to, they're in there. And so what it does is it holds the cerebellum in place, because that is your software of you. It is all the things you do that are not part of thinking. It's your breathing, it's your blood running through your body, it's your urine being made, it's just all the things that your body has to do that you just can't, you don't think about. It is you. It is like 80% of everything that you do, that little thing, that thing the size of my fist does it. Cerebellum, right back there. Very well protected, very well braced up. But in the Starchild, he noticed that those sulcuses are just like with the missing Indian, they're worn down to almost nothing. And because of the design of this, he said, you know, that brain should have slid right out of the foramen magnum. The way it's designed, and all that extra bulk to it carried back there. Because when you have hydrocephaly, for example, where you have great pressure in your head, that's what kills you. It's the pushing of your cerebellum out of your foramen magnum, and it kills you. So he said, that brain, that cerebellum, it's just not there, or it's made of a material that is very unlike our brains. It's much harder. Wow. That day I walked out, I had slowly been moving away from the idea that it was a deformity. When I walked out of that meeting, I knew it wasn't a deformity. You can't have that, a different kind of brain, and be a human. So, this is the chewing muscles that I mentioned to you, and you just can see the line, actually, in life, in the real one. You can just see the demarcation very easily, and same thing with the Starchild. Reduced by half. Again, a very small lower face, exactly like the aliens. Great. Exterior surfaces, this is amazing. Now, this is the exterior surface of the bone. Starchild. Needs some explanation. You've all heard the story that our bodies change out completely every 7 years. Have you not? We're new physical beings except for our brains. Our brains don't change, but every other part of us changes out within every 7 years. And the way it's done with bone is through these lacunae. Some of them are where the cells here transfer over, slide over, it's amazing, and go in to be destroyed, to be recycled. And others of these holes are where the new ones come up to replace. Right? Absolutely essential. Got to have them. Got to have them if you're going to be a primate on this planet. Well, am I? So if this is a deformity, where'd they go? What's that about? Now, talking about the bone earlier, it's half as thick or less, weighs half as much, but it's very, very different. This is human bone composition in a mass spectrometer. The spikes are at carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, and calcium. And the rest of them down here, sodium, magnesium, aluminum, like that. Look at Starchild. Big spike in carbon and oxygen, lower in phosphorus, lower in calcium, which means that it has a much higher level of collagen. Where's the highest the highest amount of collagen in your body? In your teeth. The Starchild's bone is made of tooth enamel. And as it turns out, it's much harder than normal human bone. Weighs half as much, half as thick, 2 or 3 times as hard. Big surprise. Big surprise. This is the detached piece of maxilla that I was telling you about. As you can see, there was yet another tooth here that was broken off. But nonetheless, here they were before this one was sacrificed to testing. I'll tell you about that later. And this is the roof of the mouth. It's only 1 inch. 1 inch. Really, really tiny. And guess what? Flat, totally flat. Roof of the mouth, flat. So did it have a tongue? Well, if it did, it was really small, like a bird tongue or something. You got to have some arch for that, for your tongue to fit. So when we first got it, the first test we did, the first test was X-rays, obviously, this, the obvious and the simple one, and we saw that it had teeth in the upper part, 5 teeth. So the radiologist said, oh, well, you got teeth down, you got teeth up, it's got to be a child, about 5 or 6. So we didn't know any better. We said, okay, called it the Starchild. Big mistake, huge mistake, because that immediately prejudiced all scientists against us, because they said, oh, well, you think it's an alien, can't have anything to do with you. And that was it. It was a big mistake. And I've lived to regret it many a time. But as you see, teeth up, teeth down, but we found out later that the teeth are so worn, heavily worn. See these chips in the enamel here? You see these cracks? That's called crazing. That's worn teeth. It's not flat like the female, but they're heavily worn. It's hard to imagine a 5 or 6-year-old with a face that small generating enough torque, even if it's eating sand every day, to do this. But, grinding corn on stone mortars with stone mortar and pestle, that's going to put grit in the food. But when the experts said, no, that's adult level wear and tear to get it up to that. But also, too, when they did pull the tooth out to test it, this was it. And I remember them saying, boy, man, that thing was hard to pull out. That was hard. It just flew over my head because it didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know what it meant. But when a child has teeth that are 5 or 6 and they're ready to come out, those roots go away. They absorb into the body. You ever notice when a kid's tooth comes out, it's just the crown. And when the teeth come down from the top that you saw in the X-ray, the roots grow as they come down into position. That's how it works. I didn't know any of that, but I found it out. So anyway, it wasn't a child. It was an adult of some age. We don't know what age. And still don't. Now, how does science explain it? Well, it has to be a deformity. First and foremost, has to be a deformity. So, what are the deformities? Well, it was cradle-boarded. A lot of them will insist that still to this day, that it was cradle-boarded. Because why? It has a flat rear of its head, cradle-boarded. It suffered from hydrocephaly. Why? Because it has expanded parietals. It has some swelling in its head, so that means it's hydrocephaly. Or it suffered from progeria. You know that Tom Hanks movie, Shipwrecked or Washed Away or whatever it is? You remember where he says, I have made fire. You know, that part? Well, that scientists are like that. When they come up against something they don't really understand, they scurry behind something called Occam's razor, which is that the simplest answer is probably the right one. And they come up with these numbskull simple answers, and it's like, I have thought of a simple answer, and that has to be it, because they thought of it. And all of these from the very beginning, that they've said it, every deformity. We have experts, we have real experts, over a dozen, that worked it over. You can go on the website and see their report. Experts have said that all of this, there's no deformity. There's no combination of deformities. Those reports are totally ignored. The Stephen Novella report is used by everybody as the single reference against it. We are well documented now, as you'll see if you read those articles that I told you about. We have footnotes out the wazoo on the Starchild one. So, you'll see very quickly what I'm talking about. Cradle boarding. This is when you tie a baby's head in a primitive society to a board so the mother can put it on her back and do her daily work and stooping over and doing the things they have to do, crops, whatever. And if you have a baby on your back and its head is not strapped down, its head will do like this because it's very weak, very big head relatively speaking, and it'll hurt its neck and probably kill it. So they strap the baby to, this is just a Navajo, but any culture that does it on a board, this is what you'll get, a flat head. This is the human found with the Starchild X-rayed, and you see that she was indeed cradle-boarded. This is what a real cradle-boarded head looks like. And it always, always, always stops at the Indian. Why? Because you can't go past that knot back there, because then you're into tearing the muscles off the neck. Tearing the neck muscles, off the skull. So it always stops here. It always looks like this. It's always about as big as the palm of my hand. And it is as flat as that table. It is as flat as the board you put it on. Why? Because a baby's bone is so soft that when you pin its head to something, it's over time, it's going to take the shape. So they come out, a cradle-boarded head, and sometimes you can see, if you're walking around in an airport, you'll see some just really flat heads in back, and those were kids that still to this day could have been, especially in Mexico. You'll see that sometimes. But anyway, there you go, truly cradle-boarded head. But here's the real kicker on, look at the Starchild. Look at the convolutions. You can see them, and you can feel them. It is not as flat as a board. Not even close. Not even close. So when I would point these things out to people who would try to tell me it was cradle boarded, they would get very upset. But when I pointed this out to them, they would get really upset, because if you look at this, you know, this is looking ahead, but if you're going to cradle board a kid and you got to stop at the Indian, you're going to crank his head back a little bit. But that's good, because he can breathe and everything. He's okay. You did that to the Starchild, he's choked in minute 1. He is strangled. He's dead the first time you try to do it. But you know, you couldn't possibly have been tying that head to a board and had it live. You show this to them, they get all grumpy and it had to have happened. So, you know, it's just so funny to watch these guys squirm. Anyway, the Starchild is a hydrocephalic. Well, you all should know what a hydrocephalic is. It's water on the brain or in the brain. And if you get that, it means your spinal fluid is not, it's not water, it's spinal fluid, but it's called that. And your spinal fluid is not draining out the way it should. And in the old days, and you know, as Philip said, the Starchild it died 900 years ago. We had carbon dating, and it said that it died 900 years ago. So there were no shunts. They both died 900 years ago. They were both carbon dated at 900 years ago, plus or minus 40 years. And they were carbon dated at separate labs at different times. So there's just no doubt they died together approximately 900 years ago in that mine tunnel, the way the lady told the story. So, when 900 years ago there were no shunts. Now kids born with it, they can shunt it, and they can live reasonably normal lives. But what it is it's like blowing air up in a balloon. Really, it's uniform. The pressure is uniform. There's no pointing the pressure in any particular direction. So you're not going to get a crease. A moron can see this. I mean, a moron can see this. You're not going to get a crease, and you're going to get splits in the sutures from the pressure. And there are no splits in any of the sutures of the Starchild. Now, experts know this. They know this, and they'll still sit there and argue with me about it, because they have to come up with something. And so they'll just rally in behind some stupid idea like this, and they just will not give it up, no matter what. All right, now, here's another point of interest. You see these veins, that's the brain pressing into the bone of the skull. Clearly no water, no fluid on this brain, and you see the Starchild has the same thing. Could have been fluid in the brain, obviously, but not on the brain. And that's the more common one. Okay, so progeria. Now, this is the latest fad among the skeptics and the experts. This is the one you'll read on Wikipedia. I've hammered them so hard on the cradle boarding and hydrocephaly. They've rallied behind this because it's so exotic and so weird. You've probably heard of it. When a kid is born with this, male or female, in the womb they start aging rapidly. And they'll generally die before the age of 10 or 12, like that, because they're aging at a very accelerated rate. So, but still they're human beings. They have human eyes and human eye sockets. They have brow ridges, they have noses, they have ears, they have a neck, a normally placed neck, but a much smaller face. And the heads do look swollen because the face is so down, and the bones do thin out. There's no question. So it has some of the things that the Starchild has, but it also has the roundness. It doesn't have the creases and do all that stuff. And more importantly, the bones, as they thin out, what happens to the bones of old people? They get brittle. They do thin out, but they get brittle and weak, and they break. And that's what happens to these kids. They're very fragile. And so there's the Starchild with its bone